So please help me in welcoming Bill to our speaker series today. And he will speak to us today about barriers to innovation in language teaching. So Bill, please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Angelica. Thank you for the direction. Thank everybody for joining today. I am going to give a talk, or I'm going to talk about things today that aren't normally what I talk about in the sense of either research or language teaching, about some other kinds of issues, because I think they're important ones that we all need to be thinking about. We very seldom talk about. And you can decide as we go through to what extent they're applicable to your own contexts. I talked about this once before this fall with another group, and it was a context I was a little more familiar with, which is a Midwest large research institution. So, but I think there might be some things in there that you'll relate to. Anyway, you'll tell me at the end or not. So will I be able to share screen now? Is that what you've allowed me to do? So I can get my PowerPoints going here. And let me get my slideshow up and running. How about play from the start? There we go. Everybody can see that, correct?
Yep.
Okay. And what I like about Zoom and PowerPoint is that sometimes the arrow keys work and sometimes you have to use a little mouse trackpad thing. So we'll see what happens here. Okay. So the title of my talk is Barriers to Innovation in Language Teaching. And as I said, this is not a talk, not the kind of topic I would normally use for a talk like this. But again, I think it's important for us to talk about some of these things. So let's first talk about the nature of innovation. I have recently come to the conclusion there are two kinds of innovation. The first is what I call pseudo-innovation, or what we might say in colloquial terms, old wine in new bottles, right? And what does that mean for language teaching? That means we basically teach the same thing, but we try to do it in a different way. So we're trying to teach the subjunctive in Spanish, but rather than do it that way, we do it this new exciting way, right? Or in French, we're trying to teach certain, like the pronominal verbs. Instead of doing it that way, now we're going to teach it this way. Okay, but the point is we're still teaching the same thing. Our content hasn't changed. We're just trying something different. I contrast that to what I call true innovation. You may like these terms. You can argue with me later if you want, which is where we're not putting old wine in new bottles. We're coming up with new wine altogether, right? And hopefully, in my opinion, no bottles at all. Just drink straight out of the vat. I don't know. In other words, true innovation doesn't mean we teach the same old thing. We're actually just reconceptualizing things completely, right? And this is very difficult to do. Most innovation in language teaching is pseudo-innovation. So true innovation is really difficult. And the point of this talk is, why is true innovation so difficult? And I'm going to talk about a number of things about why true innovation is so difficult. But first, before we get into that, is just to think a little bit about what we really want in terms of innovation. So I have some assumptions about that. When I say we're going to really do things differently, it's because a number of things are coalesced. And one is that we want our innovation to be informed by research. I mean, you can invent and innovate all you want. But ideally, as language teachers, we want to know, what does research about language acquisition and language and all that kind of stuff show us? What is useful about that research or informative? We also want classrooms that are truly focused on communication and truly focused on proficiency, not as add-ons, but as something that's central and core to what we do. Another assumption I'm making is that language teaching needs to be dynamic and local. What that means is it can't be static in the sense you do the same thing all the time. You have to adapt, and sometimes you have to do it on the fly. And it also has to be local in the sense that what works for me in my context may not work for Walter Hopkins in his context now, or may not work for Anne Violin back at Michigan State in French. So decisions we make and things we do in classes, one size fits all may not work because our populations are different. And when you think about what communication is, and participants in communication dictate a lot of how communication happens, of course, that's going to influence decisions we make and how things happen. And then finally, my assumption is that we want something that's unique to languages. In other words, what we want is get out of this mindset that language is like any other subject matter. You know, you open your Cornell catalog and there's chemistry and there's biophysics, you know, and there's mechanical engineering and then there's Spanish and there's Swahili and then there's Japanese, as though they're all the same kind of thing, right? And so my assumption is we want to do something that's unique to languages, and we want to eschew, God bless me, we want to eschew the idea that we can follow a one-size-fits-all model for subject matter. Okay, with that said, let me list for you what the barriers are we're going to talk about today. The first one we're going to talk about is knowledge. The second one is personnel. The third we're going to talk about is power and power relationships. That's a fun one. Then I'm going to touch on the nature of institutionalized education, what it does. And then I'm going to talk about time. And probably not the time you think about that immediately is popping in your mind about acquisition, about something else. So let's start with knowledge. We're going to spend some time on knowledge because this is near and dear to my heart. And I think it's foundational. And so I'm going to start off with what I think is a fact, but is possibly a semi-controversial statement. And that is that we have a knowledge problem in language teaching. We have a knowledge problem about these three basics: the nature of language, the nature of communication, and then how acquisition happens, or the nature of acquisition itself, right? My point is, in all my years working in language teaching and language acquisition research and so on, and my travels and interactions with teachers, is that these three basics tend not to form any substantial basis in the formation of the professoriate at large. And right now I'm saying professoriate because this is a university context, Cornell. I talked a little bit about this the other day to K through 12 people where their situation is a little bit different, right? But I'm speaking to you, so I'm talking about what happens at university levels or collegiate levels. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about language. There are three fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves about language if we're going to be language teachers and be informed language teachers. And that is, what is it? What the heck is language? How is it mental representation? Myself, many other people talk about language being something in your head. What does that mean? And then what are its characteristics? Is it even describable, right? Now, those of us who work in the language sciences, i.e. linguistics, those of us who work in the language sciences know that language is not textbook rules and charts. So when you open up a Spanish textbook or a Japanese textbook or a German textbook, what's on those pages is not language, okay? They are external descriptions for something that we have a difficult time really talking about. We'll see in a minute what I mean by that. But unfortunately, instructors continue to think that what they see in textbooks is what winds up in people's heads. They also think that somehow language in textbooks is informed by research on language, and quite frankly, it's not. Now, so let me give you a simple metaphor here. I don't know if it's a metaphor or an analogy. It's a metaphor. That language, for most people, it's like looking at a constellation. Language is what people perceive, but in reality, what language is quite different from what meets the eye, right? So you hear words and you see a rule like subjects and verbs must agree, but is that really what's happening? That's your external perception of something that might not be real. And so I talk about constellations to give you an example. So raise your hand if you recognize this constellation, right? Everybody recognizes constellation. I drove out to the country the other day and I was doing some stargazing. That is Orion. That's what Orion looks like from Earth. That is our two-dimensional projection, looking at a flat sky and seeing these things that we believe make a shape. And it's only part of it. All the lines aren't drawn here to show the shield and all that kind of stuff. But this is Orion. That's what it looks like here. Now, let's go out 50 light years into space. If you know what 50 light years, it's like trillions and trillions and trillions of miles into space. All of a sudden, Orion starts to look like this. You go, okay, now it looks a little bit different, right? And then if we go another 50 light years out into space, it's going to look like this. And if we keep traveling and traveling and get to a different point in space, it might even look like this. The point being is that constellations are what we think we see, but that's not really what they are. They are, in a sense, illusions. Constellations are illusions. So we project onto the sky what we perceive because we perceive it to be flat and two-dimensional space. But the universe is not two-dimensional, it's multi-dimensional, right? And so, but we are incapable of seeing that and perceiving that with our own eyes. We all kind of know this intellectually, but it's still what we see, what we perceive. What we call rules and charts and textbooks are also an illusion. They're like constellations to us. We project what we think we see. This has profound consequences for what we think happens, right, in acquisition, in the sense that if we think what's in a textbook is real, and that's what we're here to practice, somehow we must think that that becomes something in a learner's head, right? That's something that is language when it's not, right? So language is like a constellation in our head that we cannot really fathom. And that's all I'm gonna say about that. This is not a course in linguistics or language, so I'm gonna go on to the other topic, which is communication. And what we just said about language can also be said about a lot of instructors' knowledge about what communication is. In my travels, I find that most people don't have a definition of communication. Oh, it's when somebody's talking, or you're trying to get a message across, and none of these things are accurate, right, from a perspective of what communication really is. So the question for us, again, as teachers is, what is it? What are its characteristics? And also, how does it develop, right? And as I said, most instructors don't have a working knowledge or working definition of communication. So what we just said about language applies to communication. And then the third pillar of knowledge that to me is a little bit problematic is acquisition, right? And again, we can ask the same three questions. What is acquisition? What are its characteristics? And how does language evolve over time in a person's knowledge space in their head? Because it does evolve. Now, most instructors assume some sort of present, practice, produce, and assess model, right? And that's all related to explicit learning. I don't care how communicative people claim to be or what they tell you, 95% of what happens in classrooms is present, practice, produce in some way. And you might think, oh, I don't really present, I do it all implicitly. You're still trying to teach the same thing. Now you're just doing it implicitly rather than explicitly, but it's still going to be, instead of present, it's model, practice, and produce is really what happens in a lot of classrooms under the so-called communicative approach that is, to me, not communicative. But the research couldn't be clearer in that this is not how language develops in our heads. And it's not how communicative ability or even proficiency develops over time as some kind of skill or some kind of language use. Remember, there's language in your head, and then there's communication, which uses language or deploys language in some way to express and interpret meaning. Okay, so here are two key questions related to language before we move on to personnel. Just what does the average instructor really know about the nature of language, the nature of communication, the nature of acquisition? If we're going to have any kind of real innovation in language teaching, we have to stop and ask those questions. Otherwise, guess what we're doing? Old wine in new bottles, right? And how, and if we find that there's a lack of knowledge out in the field, the way I perceive there to be, how do we make such knowledge more commonplace in language teaching? How do we get that into people's hands, right? If we want innovation, how do we get people to understand the nature of language, the nature of communication, and the nature of acquisition in a way that makes sense to them and doesn't involve them having a PhD like me or like somebody else, right? Or even advanced work, right? We've got to figure out ways to do that. So those are questions, those are practical questions that confront us about knowledge. Okay, so that's one thing. Now let's get into personnel. one of the things that happens in language teaching that inhibits, in my mind, innovation, real innovation, is a lack of resources and skilled personnel. And this is partly related to knowledge. There are a lot of gifted language teachers out there, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying very often, as we'll see in a minute, people are not hired because of what they really know about language, communication, acquisition in order to be innovative, right? They're not hired for that. And I talked about this in a 2015 essay called Where Are the Experts? I did a survey of PhD granting institutions across the United States and found that if you look at language departments, things that are labeled language departments, you have in Spanish less than 7% of the faculty present across the country have any expertise in language acquisition, communication. I mean, people like me, for example. And most of those people are concentrated in certain kinds of institutions. They're extremely difficult, if not absent, on the East Coast, except for Georgetown. And they're almost non-existent in California, believe it or not, right? And so that 7% tends to be concentrated in like Midwest institutions and some Southern institutions. And the same is true in French, it's less, it's a little less than 3% of the faculty has that kind of background. So right there at that point, we don't have people who can be a nexus. We don't have the personnel who could be a nexus to help get this knowledge and information out that we've been talking about in the previous slides. Now in higher ed, in a non-four-year colleges, that is like research institutions that have graduate degrees, language instruction is often relegated to two types of people. One type is non-tenure, but perhaps semi-permanent. Sometimes, we all know there are adjuncts that rotate every year, but then there are people who are on a more permanent basis. And then there are what I call transitory. And these are people here to get a degree. And these are often referred to as graduate teaching assistants. Not every university deploys them the same way, but in the institutions I've worked in over the years, graduate teaching assistants tend to do the bulk of quote unquote language teaching, right? So now let's look at this picture a little more closely. I'm going to discuss the non-tenure issue later when I talk about power relationships, but for now I just want to say this. When we hire people to do language teaching, on what basis are such people hired? Because it becomes difficult to rely on them to bring innovation to the curriculum because they generally don't have the background. I've been involved in a lot of hiring. Walter and I, when we worked together at Michigan State, did a lot of hiring together. And interviewing people for language teaching positions, it's hard to find people who have any real background in language, communication, language acquisition, and so on. So a lot of people get hired not because of their knowledge of language, communication, acquisition. They get hired for other reasons, right? And I'm not sure what those reasons always are. We can discuss that later on if you want, but they get hired not because of those reasons. And just as important in a lot of these research institutions is they often are hired by people who themselves lack the background to ask the questions that need to be asked to see if those people can bring innovation. So you have both the hirers and the hirees who are meeting in the middle in the sense that they don't have the background necessary to bring true innovation to language instruction at the university level. Now, transitory people, such as graduate teaching assistants, can create a number of problems for innovation. And I say problems, again, I've worked with graduate students my entire life. I've directed like, 50, 60 dissertations, been on 30 or 40 others. I love graduate students. I love working with them, love training them. I have no problems with that. But in a lot of research institutions where there aren't people like me, you can have some problems. They are told, for example, and this is a quote from someone who got a degree at a major research institution, when he set foot on campus, the first day his advisor told him, "You are not here to teach, you're here to earn a degree." Now imagine that you're in a language program and you're hoping maybe some innovation happens, but this is the message you get from your advisors when you come to the program. They too, like other people, are not hired because of their backgrounds, but because they want a degree. Oh, he's going to pursue Latin American literature, or she's going to pursue contemporary French philosophy or whatever. That's why they become GTAs, not because of any background in language acquisition, communication, or language teaching. Now, those GTAs, there are a lot of them, not a lot of them, but there are some who devote the time and effort to really think about language teaching and really think about what it means to be innovative, graduate by the time they are truly ready to make a mark in the programs we're trying to innovate in. So what happens is you get this cycle of just when you think you get some grad teaching assistants to a point where you go, oh, wow, we can really do something now in our language program, they graduate. And then the language program director, if they have one, starts all over with another person. So what you wind up with transitory personnel is a lack of continuity. You don't have a trained professional teaching staff. And so that creates problems if you're trying to do real innovation. So true innovation is difficult, if not impossible, if your teaching staff lacks the background and there's no incentive to have them get it. They are transitory and create a continuity institutional memory problem for the program. And again, I hate to use the word problem, but I can't think of a more neutral word to use. They are unmotivated or demotivated to excel at teaching and learning what they need to learn because of their programs put so much work on them that they have to be graduate students first and teachers second. There is also the issue of instructor evaluation, which I'm going to touch on a little bit later, that has an impact on how we innovate. Okay, my clock is, let me check my time. I want to make sure I'm right on time. I'm right on time. Okay. The next issue to talk about is power. And so I'm going to be real blunt here because I can afford to be blunt. Look, look who I am and look where I am. Language programs are at the bottom of the pecking order for many institutions. Those who work in language programs serve at the pleasure of tenured faculty whose interests do not necessarily, and very often just don't, coincide with language teaching or line language teaching. I mean, they just don't care. And sometimes they might actually be hostile toward it. So at Research One institutions where the PhD programs reside, language programs serve as a way to fund graduate students. It's that simple. If you don't have a language program, you can't have graduate students. You have graduate students out there, therefore you have a language program, right? And there is tremendous irony in this. So let me share with you my story from Michigan State. When I was at Michigan State University, I did the numbers, of course, my first year there. I did it every year pretty much, but I only reported on it once. Enrollment in the language program constituted almost 75% of the student credit hours generated by the department. In other words, your budget, 75% of your budget is based on the student credit, the number of students and the hours they take in your basic language program, 75%. That's 3/4 of your budget. And of course, budgets are based on credit hours. That's how deans allocate money and administrators do. So you would think that language program would be the most important component of the department. Oh my gosh, it's 3/4 of our budget. Therefore, but I beg you, try to find me a mission statement at a Research One institution where they say, our language program is the most important component of our department. It's not there. I've looked for them. I've studied language websites. I can't find them. They talk about other more esoteric things like, oh, our mission is language learning and cultural enhancement and cultural competence and all that kind of stuff and providing the best graduate programs possible. But not a single one will ever say that the language program is central to what we do because it's the most significant part of our program. It's just not there. So language departments aren't language departments in reality. There's something else. And most, if not all of the power in language departments, and by power, I mean decision-making as well as monetary/budget, resides in the hands of those who aren't interested in language or language teaching. And the problem that we have for people like me, for example, if you're like me, is that none of those people who are in power want to be told that they are not versed in the very thing their department should be engaged in. When I published my article 2015, Where Are the Experts? A lot of people applauded it. but I also got a lot of backlash from people who worked linguists or language acquisitionists because they were saying, how dare you tell me I don't know about language teaching? And there is another problem there that's lurking in the background I'm not going to touch on. I was not going to be part of my slides, but I'll just mention, those of us with this kind of expertise are often considered not to have any expertise at all. Pure and simple. Because everybody's a language teacher, right? The medievalist is a language teacher. The person who does 19th century slave literature is a language teacher. And they will tell you that to your face, and that's true to a certain extent. And what they do is use that to denigrate your expertise and make sure that you're not you have no more expertise than they do. So they don't want to be told anything because it's just not fun for them. All right. So language programs are affected by power relationships in a number of ways. They don't hold the purse strings, right? They don't, I lost my little, there it is. They don't hold the purse strings, so they don't make budget decisions. They don't do the hiring. They tend not to do their hiring throughout the department. If they do, it's a very local, reduced hiring. They don't vote on the important stuff. Very often, some of the people involved in language programs aren't even considered part of the faculty. They don't have the voice and status to educate colleagues. And then this has a number of implications for innovation. So how does this power relationship make innovation difficult? I'm going to offer just two anecdotes, just so you can make it crystal clear how this happens. I was one time working with someone over the phone. I had written a series of books that are readers. They're little novelettes for learners of Spanish, and who are at like the advanced, mid-advanced, high level. To start to, I call it bridge literature, to help them start reading good quality stuff, but more at their level. So instead of reading Cien Años de Soledad, for example, or El Quijote, they would read these kinds of things. And so in talking to this one person who was in charge of the program where this was, where I was saying, you might use these materials. The question he asked me was, how do you treat the subjunctive in these materials? I went, it's literature. I mean, this is fiction. It's not about teaching the subjunctive. And then he said, well, I have to worry about that because my colleagues in the upper program, other part of the program, only care about what learners can do in their classes, and they want them to know the subjunctive backwards and forwards. And so needless to say, he never adopted those books, and he was working with a textbook that spent an entire semester on the subjunctive. There you go. So that's one anecdote. How he felt, even though he was in charge of this program, he had the pressure from others that he could not innovate because he was, guess what, a non-tenure line person. And then there was a recent posting on Facebook where someone said she was asking for advice how to go to her department chair and the dean to convince them to allow her to change the textbook for the program she was in charge of. And as it turned out, she was non-tenure line, of course, and so on. And so she felt powerless to make any decisions at all. And she would need approval from people she perceived to be above her just to make a textbook selection decision. So these kinds of power relationships are very real, and they have very real consequences. Imagine her, for example, trying to say, I don't want a textbook. Oh my God. I mean, she probably would have been up in arms. And even famous international scholars who shall not be named, who are full professors, are not immune from these power dynamics. Even those people are often put on the chopping block in departments for reasons related to trying to innovate. Okay, I'm gonna do a quick interlude here before I get on to institutionalized education, because this is an important concept. There is what I call a perceived need for articulation in language programs. For example, where I come from, 101 is the first course, 102 is the second course. So 101 has to articulate with 102. 102 has to articulate with 201, which would be the third semester. 201 has to articulate with 202, which is the fourth semester. And then 202 is supposed to articulate with what, right? And the idea is that somehow these basic courses have to articulate and feed into something that happens afterwards. So it's like this chain. But notice that the arrows go from left to right. And that's a misrepresentation of what really happens, which I'll get to in a minute. But my question for you all to think about is, what percentage of students actually continue beyond the fourth semester? And those that do, how many continue beyond several semesters after that? I have data on that if you want to hear about it. But those are important things for us to know in terms of trying to innovate in our language programs. Okay, so keep that interlude in mind because it's related to our next topic, which is institutionalized education. Okay, so institutionalized education and language as subject matter it involves a top-down, one-size-fits-all, which is part of inertia, history, and ability to think outside the box, right? So that's what the problem is with institutionalized education. And the biggest nemesis for innovation in language teaching is the system of evaluating students and assigning grades, right? Whenever you try to innovate, this happened to me yesterday in a talk that I gave with Ohio, but I've got assigned grades. So let's get to that topic. We assign grades, and very often in university situations, testing dominates grade. And you don't have to call it a test for it to be a test. You get a written composition, you correct it, you're testing them, even though it's not a sit-down test, right? So testing dominates grading. But what do we wind up testing? And it could be in a composition, it could be in a sit-down paper and pencil test. We tend to test that which is measurable, that is easily quantifiable. So we test grammar, we test vocabulary, we test listening by a multiple choice, we test reading by a multiple choice, all kinds of things we do because we want to make these things measurable so we can give it a 100, a 95, a 92.2, a A+, a B-, and so on. The tests then in turn create washback. And again, it doesn't have to be a test. It could be anything in which we try to measure something, right? The tests in turn create washback for what people teach and what students believe they're held accountable for, which is why students always go, is this going to be on the quiz? Is it going to be on the test? So grades become the motivating force for choices that students make and how they approach your class. And think about it this way. Have you ever had a student absent from your language class and they tell you the next day they were absent because they had a big chemistry test that they had to study for? So they were skipping their class that day so they could study for their chemistry test. That chemistry test was so important, it was impacting the choices they were making about their daily schedule because of the weight given to that test. And they would treat tests in a language class the same way, or how they're graded in language class the same way. And then let's not forget that students are also victims of the lack of knowledge about language communication acquisition. So they come into our classes because they've already been trained prior to getting into your class about what language classes should look like, how they should be graded, how they should be tested, and so on. So they come with some preconceived notions. The question becomes, what are those preconceived notions, right? And then eventually, what do we do about them? Now, textbook publishers are in cahoots. I love that word, cahoots. Textbook publisher cahoots with institutionalized education to produce packages that fit in the need to test, particularly at big institutions. Why? Because I can sell 1,000 copies of my Spanish textbook, or I can sell 2,000 copies of my Psych 101 textbook, or that is what publishers do. So they wind up producing materials that feed back into the preconceived notions of institutionalized education. And then those become materials that teachers are, quote unquote, saddled with or must work with, because that's what commercial publishing does. And then let's not forget placement testing. It does the same thing. Any kind of standardized placement testing tries to put measurable things so that you can check off a box and say, this student should go into 101, 102. And so what feeds back in that placement testing? The kinds of things that are taught and tested in 101, 102, 103, and so on. So you get this vicious cycle between placement testing and how testing and measurement is done in classes. Now, true innovation in language teaching would eliminate traditional grades and testing. And I know you're going, Bill, how do we do that? We can talk about that later. But that's something that we need to at least ask. How do we go about getting rid of traditional grades in testing in language classes? Is it even possible? Because if it's not, then we should give up on true innovation. Now, what is more, true innovation in language teaching would acknowledge individual differences in rate of acquisition. This is a fact of life in general, but let's look at language in particular. I have 100 students across 4 classes or 3 classes, right? And of those 100 students, there's going to be so much individual variation in where they are in terms of how communication is developing and how language in the brain or the mind is unfolding. And yet I'm going to give them tests that don't acknowledge those differences. Even the kinds of things like ACFL advocates with assessments and performance reviews and so on, don't take into consideration that. We're still trying to give a grade to something, give it to teachers from them put in their books. So true innovation would seriously question grades and testing, and it would seriously question what we do about individual differences and how they are ignored in the one-size-fits-all approach to testing and grading. Okay. Important in this discussion is the top-down approach to curriculum. And this is based on my discussion over the year with lots of different faculty members. What is needed for grad school, so imagine for PhD, what is needed for a PhD dictates what is needed for the major. So you'll be told by your colleagues, well, the major has to look this way because what if they go on to graduate school? Even though I can tell you that in most R1 institutions, about 5% of the students getting a major ever go on to do any graduate work in the language. Most majors nowadays are double major, and they're off going to med school and law school, and they're going to business school and dental school or veterinary. Who knows what they're doing, but they're not going to grad school in languages. But this is what people believe, and this is the metric they use. So we need this for grad school, therefore our majors should look like that. What is needed for the major then dictates what is expected out of language programs or what becomes before those. And then that trickles down through K through 12. So there's a real top-down approach from grad schools all the way down to middle school about expectations we should have because somebody might do a PhD sometime in a field. This impedes true innovation because goals clash. The goals of a PhD program, MA program, don't have to be the same goals as a basic language class. They shouldn't be the same goals. They are different. And yet there is this implicit trickle down from the top that we fail to address when we talk about innovation. It's very real, we just never talk about it. So my point is that a very small minority of the population, those people getting PhDs and those people teaching those PhD courses have a very profound impact on the thousands and thousands of students who never go on beyond 4th semester at a college. A very profound impact. Okay, now embedded in these issues are how instructors are evaluated. In most universities, and this may be true of education more generally, there's a one-size-fits-all approach to end-of-course evaluation. So you do your end-of-course evaluations, fill in the bubbles, and in a lot of institutions, the ones in language look the same as the ones for chemistry, look the same as the ones for history. In a few cases where universities allow departments to develop their own standardized kinds of evaluations, these are developed around issues related to upper division courses and reflect campus-wide evaluations more generally. I was involved in the redo of evaluations for the last department I was in, and there was a pull from the people who didn't work in the language program to make the evaluation meet their courses. I kept saying, but what we want to evaluate and ask about instructors in the lower level courses is different. And so there's this big tension in trying to get these evaluations to do 2 different things. And we wound up with a longer evaluation, and some things were, I mean, it was a hodgepodge is what it was. And we wound up, Walter and I and Matt developed our own internal things that we use as metrics every now and then to check on things going on. But this is a problem because you want a one-size-fits-all to evaluations, and that may not be the way to go if you want to have innovation. So evaluations for language teaching need to be different than for teaching literature or teaching chemistry or teaching science, any kind of science. Okay, and this is particularly true of observation and classroom visits. So to what extent do our evaluations reflect themes for principles from language communication acquisition? When I go in and I look at that language teacher, I'm looking at what's going on in classrooms. Am I keeping in mind the nature of language, the nature of communication? How does it, is that informing the evaluation form I use and what I'm looking at or not? And so a lot of these things, again, comes back to what we know about the basics of language and language acquisition. So how does this nature of institutionalized education impede innovation in language teaching? Well, by relying on the one-size-fits-all model for departments, it makes it very difficult to innovate because it's very hard for people to make the argument that Spanish has to be different from chemistry. You can do that intellectually, but to actually make it happen is incredibly difficult. Administrators like the one-size-fits-all approach. By keeping language instruction in so-called language departments, that's also a problem because that may not be the best place for language learning. Language departments are really not language departments. They are, as I said, something else. And institutionalized education aids and abets those barriers related to what we talked about before: knowledge, personnel, and power. Those are all part of what institutionalized education does to keep us from innovating. Okay, the last topic, and then I hope we have some time for questions, is time. Now, there are two issues related to time. The first is the following lament. A lot of us here, I only have them for 2 years, so I have to make sure they know all the basic grammar before they get out of my course. I have no comment on that. Wait, I actually do have a comment on that. That to me is no excuse for not thinking about innovation. I mean, in the sense that it's true that you only have them for 2 years. But there are other questions we're going to ask later, I think, that we need to be asking. And if you know where I'm headed, I'm calling for a revolution is what I'm calling for. So the second issue related to time is this, and this is more important. Who has the time to do what is needed to bring about real innovation? Who has it? Who has it? So let's start with language program directors. People like me, who used to direct a large language program, people like Walter Hopkins, who used to work with me in language program, and others like us. Language program directors tend to be non-tenure and thus teach heavier loads than tenure line faculty because they're assumed not to do research and some of the other service components. They're given more teaching to do. Sounds good, right? Except that what they have to do to manage a program would boggle the minds of tenure line faculty in literature and even in linguistics if they had to do the job. So you think, oh yeah, they don't have this other thing they got to do, so we'll just give them more teaching. And then you wind up taking the time away that they need to actually do the work to innovate and make the language program grow and move in certain directions, right? And so that becomes a varied innovations where you get a lot of pseudo-innovation. Now, for those who are tenure line who direct language programs, they tend to be assistant professors whose tenure clock doesn't allow for real innovation. In fact, they are told sometimes when they are hired, don't really worry about the language program. You need to work toward tenure first. So they spend their first 5 years, go up for tenure, they're 6 years, they spend their 5 years getting their scholarship, making nice with colleagues, all the kind of stuff you do to get tenure and to build your profile. In the language program, you just have some pseudo innovation to make it look good, or because that's all you have time for, because of the pressures you have on you. It's not the assistant professor's fault, it's just institutionalized education. And you add the power dynamics of professors who are your seniors telling you things sometimes behind the scenes. And then what happens is the die is cast. By the time you get tenure, the language program is what it is. And most people with tenure stop innovating. They don't, okay, it's good enough. We just keep going with what we have. Even though now, technically, they could take the time away from the other stuff, but the die is cast. So the pattern is set in their academic lives. Now let's look at the bigger picture with time. When I revamped the language program at Michigan State, there was me, there was my assistant, who was Walter, I think he's still there. There was a TA assigned to me, Leanne Spino, and then my technology expert was Dan Trago, right? So, and I'm not saying we did real innovation. We were somewhere between pseudo-innovation and real innovation. Again, because I was really struggling against those barriers, right? It took us 2 years to do what we needed to do. And then Walter and I still tweaked after that. We still were going back and changing this and changing that, and going back and doing some things here and there. When we got rid of testing, we moved that out. Walter and I wrote an article about that. We put the can-do statements in. Walter and I and Dan wrote about, or Walter and I wrote about that. It was Dan and Walter and I that wrote about the testing thing. And so it took a full 2 years just to launch the first 101 course. So my calculation, when we got done, was that for every hour of class time and every hour of online instruction that went with it, because there was a hybrid thing, it took 30 hours of labor to get it there. So between the four of us, it took 30 hours to get something that was ready to go. Something we could hand to teachers and something students could do online. 30 hours. That's a lot of time. Now, let's tie time into institutionalized education. Why? Because time is money. To give people time is to spend money. In other words, go back to the idea of budgeting. If I take you away from teaching to allow you to innovate, then I have to hire somebody to do that teaching that you're not doing, and now I'm spending money, right? Universities don't like to spend money. They just don't, except on, guess what? I won't say it. Universities don't like to spend money, and department chairs very often don't know how to justify these expenditures. They don't know how to build them. They don't know how to figure these things out and what it really means. And so if there's no institutional money, there is no time, pure and simple. Sounds like Einstein, right? With time and space, you know, and all that kind of stuff. But if there's no institutional money, there is no time. That's a basic fact. Okay, so what did we talk about today so far? Identified just 5 barriers to real innovation in language teaching. And again, those are knowledge. I think we have a knowledge problem in the professoriate at large. There's a personnel problem, which was related to knowledge. There's a power problem, which is also related to institutionalized education. And so are knowledge and personnel. And there's the time to be able to do real innovation. So all these barriers conspire so that we get pseudo-innovation, which you probably are thinking it's better than no innovation. I wouldn't argue with that. But it's not going to be the real kind of innovation we really have been talking about for about 40 years now. The barriers seem insurmountable. And again, that's probably why we get pseudo-innovation. The work now is to get together. This is what we have to do in universities. So there's no direct implication from what I'm talking about, other than we need to start getting together and discussing what to do about barriers to innovation in language teaching, if indeed we want innovation, right? We may come to the conclusion that real innovation is literally impossible. I personally don't think it is. But again, it depends on the people you have to help you make the arguments and do stuff. So my starting point is, any of you out there want to get going on this, you have to start dealing with institutionalized education. And you have to ask the hard questions, and you have to confront institutionalized education and know what it's doing, both in front of your face and behind the scenes. Otherwise, you're going to keep on doing pseudo-innovation, if anything at all. So we need to form discussion groups. The first thing you need to do is make a wish list of all the real innovations you would like to have in language teaching. What really, like, I would love to get rid of textbooks. I'd love to get rid of desks. I'd love to do this. I'd love to do that. Because make a big wish list of all those things. Then make a list of the things about institutionalized education that work against those innovations. So once you got your wish list, go back, things we talked about today and things you think of in your own that are going to work against that, right? And then see if you can find creative solutions. You might be able to. You have to think outside the box. And then once you do that, you have to develop a plan. I always try to work in 5-year plans. Some of you who know me know I do this. So you go by the end of year 1, I want this to happen. By the end of year 2, so because innovation is not going to happen in one fell swoop. It does have to be brought in, right? Because you're going to change this and then change. You could try to change everything at once. That's very difficult to do. But if you have a plan, it seems much more doable and less exhausting to you when you do it. So real innovation, it takes work, and it takes planning, and it takes time. And that's all I got to say to you right now about that. And there's my first novel. My second novel is coming out in 2 months. So be on the lookout for it. This novel won a prize. There it is. You can see it here. So, and I have a copy to give away if Angelica wants to work on that. So do we have time for any discussion or questions, Angelica? I don't know.
Yes.
I went about 50 minutes, so I'm sorry. I think we have about 10 minutes.
Yep.
Unless you want to go longer. I'm here. I'm not doing anything as I'm drinking water.
Well, first of all, Bill, thank you very much for this stimulating presentation. And I think we have a lot to think about here. So at this point, we definitely are interested in hearing from everybody in the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll ask you to unmute yourself. And this may take a little bit of time for people to process and let things.
And feel free. I have no problem. If you want to ask me something that has nothing to do with this talk, because you've got me here. Hey, well, this guy knows something about language acquisition. I'm going to ask him a language acquisition question. You can ask me anything you want. I don't care. Just don't ask my age and my weight. Although I did lose my 10 COVID pounds, so that's good.
Well, there you go. I think I gained those. So thank you, Bill. So do we have any questions in the audience here? Don't be shy. And you are also welcome to disagree. And I know I will mispronounce your name again. I'm sorry, Alex. Please pronounce your name for me first.
No, you got it.
Destin is there. Destin's there. Hi, Alex. Hi, Alex.
So I was wondering if you think that, for example, here at Cornell, we have a Roman Studies department where we have Spanish, French, and Italian. And most of the people there study either literature or history. So should we have a separate department with only languages in that case? Would that allow for better teaching?
That could. I mean, that's when people sit down and discuss these things and form groups. That might be one idea that emerges. You can find out if that would even fly or not. But that certainly is one way to think outside the box. Maybe language stuff should be removed from language departments. Who knows? In some places, there's some models like that, Alice, that are out there, for example, but they're not complete. So like the only one I'm familiar with, because I interviewed there once, was San Diego, University of San Diego, University of California, UC San Diego, where they had removed the basic language program and put it with the linguistics program, which I'm not sure was the best thing either, but at least it was out of the hands of it. And then the literature, people in literature became the National Literatures Department, something, and they handled upper division courses. So they had a few courses like on composition and things like that. But language itself was then handled. So even Spanish, French, German was all in the linguistics department. So that's one model that may or may not work. It just depends on the institution. Again, remember what I said earlier is that one of my assumptions is language teaching is going to be dynamic and local. So a decision you might make at Cornell might be different than what's made at San Diego State University, which might be different with what's made at Michigan State, which might be different than what's made at University of Alabama.
Great. Anne.
Okay, my question for you, Bill, is I totally agree with you, of course, on everything you said. I think there's also a need to, I mean, besides training your colleagues and the faculty, there's also a need for training students on how to learn a language. How early, how often do you think that we need to be doing that? And how explicitly do we need to be doing that for them to buy into what we're trying to do if we are trying to innovate?
Yeah, we need to do that at every level. Let me just say something tangential, and I'll come back to be more direct with your question. I was talking to a group of teachers yesterday from Ohio, and they were largely K through 12. They're like a couple of university types there. And one of the things that's always intrigued me is how much innovation is trying to happen in K through 12 with language instruction. Some of the best innovation is happening there. But then what happens is they hit a wall, because then they start to get signals from universities that students aren't placing into the upper division because they don't know this, they don't know that. And it's because of the placement test, right? And so there's that trickle-down effect from what universities are doing that's keeping all the real innovation happening in K through 12. My point being is that if we didn't have that, imagine students coming from K through 12 into the university system with different preconceived notions. Wait a minute, in the French class I took in high school was, we never spoke English. It was like we did this and we did that. You know, we weren't like, we didn't even have a textbook. So you imagine if the preconceived notions are different, because we allowed middle school and high school, for example, to be different, but they struggle with that because of the top-down pressure from universities. So I think what we need to do is, this is something I've mentioned before, is that we need to develop really short little modules. Videos would be great to put in teachers' hands who want to start working innovation and need to work on both colleagues and students, something you can drop in and show for, like, here's a 4-minute video on X, here's a 4-minute video on Y. And if we had those, I mean, Angelica, that'd be great for a language resource center type thing to do. You know, develop 10 little 4-minute modules. You know, this is how this happened. This is how this is why we do that. And I think those could be really useful in helping people. Again, and they have to also, one of the things that you need to do very early on, if you're trying to do something really different, is you have to tell your students upfront, day one, how they're going to be evaluated. Because if they think they're going to be evaluated the way they're evaluated other places, then they're going to keep those preconceived notions. So you need to show them up front, this is how you're going to be evaluated. And they'll go, oh. And so they need to see a fit between evaluation and what you're doing in class. So that needs to happen. So there's two fronts: educating them about language acquisition, communication, and then making sure they see right away from the very first day that how they're going to be evaluated, assessed, how they're going to be assigned a grade is going to be directly linked to what happens in class.
And actually, speaking of evaluation, John just put the link to get your feedback on our speaker series, which is slightly different from the evaluation that you're talking about. But if you can provide us feedback on our series, that would be much appreciated. Mijong, you have your hand up.
Okay. Hi, Bill. Thank you very much for your presentation. I could relate to everything you said, especially the time barrier. So as you said that, our language teachers are having very high load of teaching, so that while we are teaching, that we don't have time to do real innovation. So we really need time to get a 1 semester off or a course release from supported by the department or the university. I heard a long time ago at Cornell that they offered to the non-tenure track language teachers the time. But now that they are not giving us time to do that. So my question is, do you have any tips to proceed to successfully, that we can proceed to get, the language teachers can have time to do the real innovation?
I don't. I think though that what you need to do, or what a first step would be, and again, it's not a tip, but the first step is, who are the people that hold the purse strings? They're usually deans and deans' offices. So it'd be interesting to have focus groups, and you'd have to do several of these, Mijong. You can't just do one, but several meetings in which you sit down with the department chair and the dean, and you talk just about these issues. What is innovation? What do we want to innovate? And what does it really mean? Here's what we want to do. Again, remember I said this first step is make a wish list, all the things you want to innovate. And then think about all the barriers. And one of those barriers might say, we need time. That's the first, I got to find some time for us to do some of these innovations. So how do I do that? Well, now I need to have discussions with my chair and the dean. So you need to be able to go to the dean and the chair with, here's what we would like to do. And here's what it would mean. And here's how it would enhance the learning experience. And you would probably have a series of discussions because you have to convince the dean as much as you have to convince your chair. If not, I think you have, I think you have to convince your dean more than convince your chair. The chair will go along with the dean if the dean says, this is a good idea. But if your dean's not on board, but you also cannot go over your chair because of the power relationships, you can't go over your chair's head and speak directly with the dean. It needs to be a discussion among all the stakeholders, the dean, the department chair, and then one or two people representing, for example, the language teaching staff or faculty, whatever you want to call them. And so my tip only is make your list first, what you want to do that's going to be truly innovative, and then go and talk about why you need time, talk to the dean about it, and see if you can't negotiate something. And again, it's going to take several meetings. You might get something out of it, be surprised. So it depends on who your dean is too. So I've had all different kinds of deans. Some listen more than others.
So
it also helps. Can I say one thing? In my past experience is because of who and what I am. Let's be honest, who I am. I'm Bill VanPatten, right? I'm the diva of SLA. I'm the international guy, right? I get a lot of dean's ears, and so I can be very convincing because I know stuff, but I can just talk off the cuff to a dean and say, well, here's why and this and so on, and how the budget, I mean, I know everything from budgets to language acquisition, you know. And so it'd be really helpful if you had somebody like that. If you don't, maybe you can figure out a way to bring somebody in. You know, I'll Zoom with your dean if you want, for example. I mean, things like, I mean, okay. So anyway, Angelica, sorry.
Yeah, no. Before we go on to the next two hands, I see you, but we had a question in chat from Chris, and he is asking just a clarification. Can you give examples of what pseudo-innovation might look like and what true innovation is?
Okay, here's innovation. Here's pseudo-innovation. COVID happened, right? And so everybody said, oh my God, we can't teach face-to-face. So what we did is we figured out a way to teach non-face-to-face, but doing the same old thing. That is pseudo-innovation. And before COVID, when some of you may not know this, but CAL, computer-assisted language learning, has been around since the 70s, if not the 80s. It's originally it started at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, believe it or not, with the old Plato system. And so technology has always been this, you know, people look at innovation technology and getting technology in language learning, getting technology in language teaching. And what do? We do the same old thing with technology. It hasn't innovated anything, but it looks like innovation because it's something we weren't doing before. We're doing the same old thing, but now we're adding some technology to do it. Those kinds of things to me are pseudo-innovation, right? Or here's a classic example of pseudo-innovation too. Is this, I just wrote about this today. I'm getting ready to do a little module on this. Is this whole ridiculous notion between explicit and implicit teaching. And because teachers are arguing, you know, about should I teach explicitly, implicitly, but you know, isn't learning actional about implicit? Yes, it is. A role of explicit should be downplayed. But what that translates for many teachers and many researchers as well, I'm still trying to teach the past tense now to my students. I'm just not telling them what it is and doing rules. I'm trying to teach the past tense implicitly. That is pseudo-innovation. Real innovation would be, I'm not going to teach the past tense at all. It will come up when it comes up. That would be real innovation, for example. So a lot of this, what's called implicit teaching, is basically explicit teaching without the explanation there. And so you're still trying to teach the same old stuff. I hope I gave three
Thank you.
examples. I tried to give 3 examples to illustrate. So
Thank you. Lingsu, you're next.
Hi, thanks. I guess I have many questions I could ask, but I'll just ask this. And this is something I really would like to hear hear some ideas from you sort of in the positive light. Speaking as a graduate student who really has an interest in language teaching, and also, looking at the sort of graduate, the sort of postgraduate school employment landscape for people like us in linguistics or in literature, where really, for many of us, language teaching is a very viable employment path, right? How do you think the experience or the arrangement of grad students as language class teaching assistants or co-instructors, how could that be sort of positively changed or modified so as to both enhance the continuity or the sort of innovativeness of the entire language program as you were talking about, and also for the benefit and the training of people who are sort of positive, who want to be positively involved and grow in that experience. I'm sort of trying to push a positive light onto this, because I mean, from my experience, I see that there is a possibility for for a synergy there.
right, but like I said, are you talking about the graduate programs themselves, or are you talking about? I'm not quite sure what you're focused on in terms of that synergy, or what you're.
So, I mean, I guess plainly, I guess I could speak more plainly. I don't think it's always necessarily true, in my experience at least, that being a grad student in a in a different academically focused program, it's necessarily the case that I've been told, or somehow I've been forced to first be a grad student, a researcher in training, and only secondarily as a language teacher. But I do also see that there really doesn't seem to be any sort of kind of intentional programming in place for me to sort of get myself to be a better and better language teacher.
Right, gotcha. Okay, yeah, I know I think I understand your question now. I once advocated, and I still advocate for this, is that I don't care if you want to get a. Let's look at the landscape, because when you initiated your question, it was about the landscape that awaits a graduate student when they get out their degree. What kind of job are they going to get? The days of getting a pure job in some field of literature or some field of linguistics or some field of cultural studies are pretty much gone. And I don't think they're coming back. I've been looking at this for a while. And in fact, all the PhD students that we dealt with at Michigan State over the 8 years I was there, or 7 years I was there, all wound up in jobs. The PhDs all wound up in jobs where half of what they did was language teaching. And what they told me was, thank God I did some work with you, even though they were doing Latin American literature or French literature, whatever they were doing, because I wouldn't be as good in my job. I don't think I'd be as comfortable. So I've been telling people that graduate programs need to open up. The day of being a strict scholar in X is over. But this is hard for people to hear. I would like to see graduate programs at least have an area, an option you can take, right? Most graduate programs like have a main area and 1 or 2 options. Why can't one of your options be language acquisition or language teaching? Why can't that be an option? So you could be contemporary Japanese literature, you could be medieval studies in Spanish, I don't care. But hey, I'm going to choose language acquisition, language teaching as a minor area because I know that's going to help me. That's the reality of the future, right? And then what would that look like, right? How could we build that in? It doesn't always have to be coursework. It could be credits accumulated through, like, let's say Angelica has different things you participate in that work on all this kind of stuff, and you accumulate so many of those credits doing those professional development and so on. It's equivalent to a course, equivalent to whatever. And then that goes on your record. You've completed this minor area in language. And that would be really, really useful. Really, really useful for graduate students. But the problem is it's going to be really hard to get graduate programs to do that. And that's really what they need to do. Because the landscape is pretty much what it is. It's not going to change. It's not going to change. And tenure track jobs. A lot of people don't know this, but they think, oh, the tenure track problem is just one that, you know, is a recent phenomenon. Actually, it was Harvard that started this back at the turn of the 20th century, back in the early 1900s. It was Harvard that started to not give tenure positions. They cut back and say, you know, we're not going to have tenure positions where we're going to do lecturers and senior lecturers. We're going to create these new categories of people, and then slowly show you that trickle through the profession. And so we've just been dealing with that all for decades now. But I do think that having some options in your graduate program would be really useful for you to get out and feel comfortable with your job and like what you're doing too.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bill. Being mindful of the time here, I want to remind everybody real quick about our next talk. We push that back by a week per request from our speakers. So that will be May 13th, Thursday, May 13th at 4:30. Eduardo Viana da Silva is talking about developing an open and inclusionary language textbook for Portuguese. And I see there are still 2 hands up, but we do have something else that we need to whisk Bill to. So Sylvia, why don't you ask your question? And that's what we will be closing with today.
Oh, no, because it's not a short question. Because, you know, we all dream, you know, for the time and the resources to do what you're suggesting. But it sounds like you got some of that. And I was just wondering, what was your wish list at MSU? And if you can just pick one true innovation or pseudo-innovation that you implemented there, and you could describe it to us, just as an inspiration.
We had a textbook, but the textbook was banned from the classroom. So that's one of the things we did. Like when we would go in and look at classes, we didn't want to see textbooks. In fact, students even stopped bringing their textbooks to class. I don't need to bring my textbook to class. And so classes became a different space. The textbooks became an outside resource for students. It allowed us to do things, spend class time in different ways that we wouldn't have done otherwise if we hadn't gotten rid of the textbook in the classroom. Again, we did have a textbook because I also understood the psychology of students at the time, because I was getting us to a point where eventually we wouldn't have any textbook at all. But if I had stayed there, we would have developed our own materials and so on. But just getting the textbook out of the classroom and making the classroom something different was a high priority for me. And that's what I was working at. And we pretty much got that. So we would go to class and there'd be no textbooks. There'd be PowerPoint slides. There'd be this, there'd be that, there'd be who knows what. There's all kinds of different things we'd be seeing. But there were no textbooks. And that made classes quite different.
And this was for first semester?
It was for four semesters.
Because I was gonna say, getting rid of the book is easier in the higher levels, like, third semester, fourth semester. In the first semester, it will be quite a challenge, especially if you have a team of graduate students working with you. Like, the amount of effort creating all those materials must be interesting. Time, money.
But what we also did too is that this goes back to Langs's question about opportunities for graduate students who are interested in teaching and so on. Is Walter was really good, for example, and Matt did this too in French, is creating clusters of graduate students who liked working together. And they would create things and then we would review them and then we'd put them up for sharing to people because they were like, oh, I did this in class, this worked well. And then we'd take that and we'd go, that looks good. And we'd innovate a little bit more. And then here, have this, here you go. And so we also utilize, very often what happens is it feels like it's one person doing it, but there are also creative ways to involve people. And Langsu, for example, I didn't say this, but one of the things I was able to do at Michigan State for a couple of French students was they wanted an independent study. They could take up to one independent study for their MA program, and they did. And we worked on teaching materials in French together. And for the French program, and they wound up developing all these great tasks and things that we did, and some online stuff. And so there are different ways to tackle this. You just have to, again, think outside the box. So.
Were you able to get rid of the testing like you were suggesting earlier?
Yeah, what we did is we wrote an article about this. Go to Foreign Language Annals. I forget what year. I think it was 2016 we published this. We got rid of testing. What we did is we took the tests and put them online for students. So here, take these tests online. And what we found was there was no difference between whether they took a test in class or took a test online. The scores were literally exactly the same. And so we said, well, that was a waste of class time to make you take tests. That happened early on. And so, but students like to say, oh, I took a test, you know, so we just put them on as an online test. Here's what they're, you know, they're worth 10% of your final grade. You can take them online. They took those, like, oh, I'm in charge of this. I get 10% of my final grade. They're happy about that. And we took that in class time for tests and developed can-do statements instead. So tests got replaced with can-do statements, which were not graded the same as tests. They're almost either or. You could do it or not do it, basically what they were. And almost all students could do it, right? So because of the way we always worked, we always had a task-driven program by which you were always trying to build success in. So when you got to the can-do statement, you almost didn't have to do the can-do statement because your students should be able to do it. So.
And there was a write-up about this that we referred to in our OLC over the summer. So if you can't find that in there, let me know. That was in the module on assessment. So everybody, please help me in thanking Bill for this very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you, Bill. Enjoy the rest of the semester, and we look forward to seeing all of you soon.